working with the second set of PowerPoints called New England, and we just set up and talked about Puritan theology, which is very, very strange to us. And now we need to look at what the Puritans did in setting up their society in Massachusetts. Massachusetts and Virginia are the templates. Everything else is modeled off of these patterns. So I'm not interested in any, really, there are very few variations on Massachusetts. New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Maine are all duplicates of Massachusetts as people spread out. The one difference is, of course, Rhode Island, where there is complete freedom of religion, and that is one of the few places in America where there is, or in the world where there was. So we need to look at the society and culture that the Puritans set up, because they are really the strongest influence on America today still. These ideas carry through. So the time period we're talking about, the first Puritans arrived, the Pilgrims arrived about 1620, and over the next 30, 40 years, it was called the Great Migration. A large flood of Puritans came to the Massachusetts colony. The Anglicans in England were purging Puritans. They were being persecuted. There is also an economic depression. King James in Britain marries his son to the granddaughter of the Spanish king. This is the same king who had sent the Armada, so there is an alliance between Spain and England, which many, many Englishmen thought was complete heresy. Oh my God, we're talking to the Catholic Spanish. So there is a move to move out of New England. Moving down to slide number 6 on the PowerPoint, you see a lot of ice there. This is the Hudson River. My son used to live very close to the Hudson River, and he's a fanatic jogger, and he would run along the banks of the Hudson. There is a walking path there in this kind of weather with spikes on his shoes. This is the territory that the Puritans are moving into. This is not rare weather. The Hudson is a big river. Remember, they landed a plane on it about 10 years ago. Very deep river, and that thing freezes over in the winter. So these are very severe conditions. Again, being Texans, that's not something we're used to. New England is anything north of New York and Pennsylvania. That is New England, and basically Massachusetts for a long time. Very cold. You have a very short growing season, about 5 months. So large agriculture and a lot of profitable plants are not really possible there. This used to be land that was scraped by glaciers in the last ice age, so the soil is very rocky, not very good agricultural soil at all. Not too much you can grow there other than grains, wheat, rye, barley. Huge numbers come. You have about 40,000 people come in 20 years in the Great Migration. By 1650, there are 44 towns. And by the time of the Revolution, there are over 250 different towns in New England. So this area was fairly heavily populated fairly quickly. Who comes? Nuclear families, parents and children. About half of those who came were children under the age of 16. Also a lot of older people as well, and long lifespans in New England, unlike Virginia and the South, probably because of the cold weather and less insects to carry disease. People tended to live almost as long as they do today. This was a huge benefit to society because you had accumulated wisdom. You could learn from your parents. You could learn from your grandparents as well. Some people, if they had the money, brought their servants, but you have families. This is unlike the Spanish, unlike the French, and unlike most of Virginia. So the ratio of male to female is very important here. In New England, of course, there's always more males. There's always more need for male labor, but it's pretty close to 1 to 1. In Virginia, the ratio of male to female was 4 to 1. In the Spanish colonies, 10 to 1. In Brazil, which became all sugar plantations, the ratio of male to female, 100 to 1. So what they can do in Massachusetts is recreate a fairly normal society. The Puritans who came, if you didn't have enough money, often the community would collect money and pay your passage over, but they screened very carefully for character. They only wanted upstanding citizens to arrive. No prisoners, no convicts for a long time. Oftentimes, people were sent back. They come quickly. In the first year, there are 17 ships with 2,000 people. 200 ships in the first 10 years, 16,000 people. So you don't have a whole lot of very wealthy people, again, because why would you leave if you were very wealthy in England and doing well, unless you're the wrong religion? And the destitute poor, not so much, although sometimes they did take up collections and bring them. So very important, I think, illustrations, the next couple of them, slides 7 and 8, are typical little cabins. They are building log cabins, which they learned from the Swedes and the Finns, actually, down in Delaware. Lots of trees in America. You are living, and I love that first picture because those trees look like they're very threatening, like Lord of the Rings and the Ents. But you are living next to the wilderness, and there is danger the minute you walk out your door. Not only are there wild animals, but there are, in many cases, enemy Indians who are ready to attack you. So that little lady, there's a wonderful story that's a true story of a little woman living in a cabin like this at the edge of the woods, and she has her little garden next to her, and she goes out to work in the garden, and she has her little baby. She puts him on a blanket on the ground, and she's weeding. And she has a little dog with her, and the dog barks, and, shut up, leave me alone, I'm working. Dog keeps barking. She turns around, and there is a mountain lion, a panther, about 3 feet away from the blanket with the baby, because cats like to pounce on their food. The woman screams. The cat jumps back. She grabs up the baby, runs in the cabin, locks the door, cries hysterically. Husband comes home a couple hours later. She tells him the story. He tracks the mountain lion, finds it, kills it. In the stomach of the mountain lion was the little dog. But the moral to that story is anytime you walk outside your door, you are risking your life for a long time in New England and in the South as well. Okay. The slide number 9 is also in your textbook, and it's a really good picture, something we never think of in Texas. When you are clearing a heavily wooded area, you chop down the trees so that your crops can have sunlight, fine. What do you do with the stumps? And anybody who has tried to remove a stump knows what I'm talking about. Even with chemicals today, we dynamite some of them. They're there for years. So when you're plowing, with slide number 10, wooden plows around these stumps for 10 or 15 or often 20 years until the stump finally rotted away. This is very hard work to get a little wheat out of that field. We have no concept of this in Texas, where most of the land is open. The next two slides, 11 and 12, are very important. Imprint them on your brain, because this is a great visual of Puritan society. They are recreating the world that they knew in England. And most of these people came from small towns or small farms. Most of them most of them from the area, southern England, around London, not from the city, but from the small towns and farms around there. A lot of skilled craftsmen came, a lot of farmers came, pretty much all middle class. When they set up their towns, because this was a communal enterprise, they set them up as communities. So there is authority from the community leaders, but everybody is connected and obligated to everybody else. So first thing they built was a church, of course. There's a picture of a New England church a couple slides down. You can drive all over New England. It looks exactly like that today. It is in the middle of the town square. Small towns in New England still look exactly like this pattern. And then you have the village green, the area around it. These were grazing places where the cattle and livestock could be brought in overnight, so they wouldn't be eaten by wild animals or stolen by Indians. It's kind of a protected corral in a way. And then you have all of the agricultural land. So a person living in one of those little houses would have a field of woodland and another area down by the river where the soil is very rich and another area that's maybe not so good, and different plots of land in different areas around the village. But the houses are all built on top of each other. The question is, you got an empty continent here. Why build on top of each other? Of course, the first answer is fear of Indian attack and fear of wild animals, which was a very good reason. The houses, by the way, did not touch each other, but were fairly close to each other, like a modern subdivision today, I would say. Okay. The other reason, you keep your eye on everybody else. No one in New England was allowed to live alone. You had to live in town. Even if you wanted to live way out on the edge, they did not allow you. Why? Everyone is born evil. How do you keep people from doing evil things or dancing with the devil on Friday night? You keep an eye on your neighbors. We would call them today probably micromanagers, certainly absolutely very nosy. Anybody who lives in a small town knows exactly what I'm talking about. You can't get away with anything because everybody knows. And the first thing they're going to do is call your mom and say, hey, do you know where Fred was last Friday night? I saw him. So this is exactly what Puritan society is like, not something most of us would choose to live in. The goal was to create a pure society of true believers. Cannot purify the Church of England, it's too corrupt, so we will leave and create what they called from the Bible a city on a hill. We will create a perfect world. Everybody will look at it and say, oh, this is a model, and copy us. We have a covenant, a contract with God to do the right thing. Why come again? Land, land, land. Everybody has, there's no birth control, everybody has 7, 10, sometimes 12. My favorite, and this, I'm not making this up, Benjamin Franklin was the youngest of 19 children. So how do you do this in England? You didn't have the property to divide. In America, you have enough land that each of your sons at least can have his own farm. This was impossible in England. John Winthrop, leader of Massachusetts for a long time, comes with 7 children, 6 of whom are sons, and has another 6 in America. In Britain, it was forbidden to divide your land, you divide your property. So a wealthy man who had, let's say, Downton Abbey, 1,000 acres, could not divide it. Why was this rule put in place? So the rich stayed rich. Because if you kept dividing in 3 or 4 generations, you ended up with very tiny farms. Instead, what they had was primogeniture, primo meaning one, gen, the root word genetics, heredity. The eldest son inherited. Daughters got a dowry, they got money, they got stuff, but not land. Land could not be divided. So the draw for America is, oh my gosh, you have unlimited land for all your sons. Okay, moving down to slide 16 is the Puritan family. The textbook does a pretty good job of this. They call the family a little commonwealth. Society, the government, the economy was modeled on the family. If you had good families in your community, you would have a good society. Disorderly, disruptive families, malfunctioning families were a threat not only to themselves, but to society. God likes a nice, ordered community, according to the Puritans. They came as families. Don't forget, they come in large numbers and they come as families. It's a very cold climate. There was less disease. The families often stayed intact for a long time. In the South, 50% child mortality before the age of 5. In the North, 25%. Children still died a lot, being fragile, but half the rate in Massachusetts that they did in the southern colonies. If you made it to about the age of 20, you probably, in the northern colonies, would live to your early 70s or longer. It was not rare to see 80-year-olds in Massachusetts, which is about what we have today. They did a sample. In one county, somebody went back and sampled the birth and death dates, and 30% of the women, 20% of the males lived to be 70. 22% of the whole group lived into their 80s. So very long lifespans, which is a great factor for stable families and stable communities. Most spouses kept their original marriages. One or the other did not die. Most of them stayed married into old age, and also oftentimes lived next door with grandparents. Very low death rates because of cold weather killing bugs. No one lives alone as a Puritan. You could not have a farm on the edge of town. If you were widowed and lost your spouse, you were required to move in with a kid or have kids moved in with you. A single person who showed up in Massachusetts was put to live with a quote-unquote good family. If you showed up as a married man without your wife, they sent you back to England. Go get her and come back. Then we'll talk. If people were having domestic problems, not getting along, they split up the husband and wife, left the kids with the wife, and they placed both of them in different families, in basically model families, to learn how to get along and behave well. And most of the time they reunited. A local government watched out for this. If you tried to move out, you were ordered to move back in. If you didn't do that, they would come and tear your house down. You had to live in the community. No one lives alone. Land was allocated by how many people in your house and what your job was. Ministers always got a little bit more land. You had 10 kids, you had bigger property because you had more mouths to feed. Your kids grew up and moved off. You don't need that much land. And what the community would do is a church group of elders would come and reallocate your property. In other words, you don't need all this land. We're going to take this 100 acres, and your neighbor here over here has 12 kids. There's only 2 old people in this house. He needs the land. Not exactly capitalism, much more like socialism, at times verging on communism. If you didn't do this voluntarily, they would come and take it. Same thing with some property, particularly livestock and equipment. You had 3 cows, your neighbor just lost his cow, he has 4 little kids who need the milk. It was your Christian duty as a good Puritan to give your neighbor one of your cows. If you didn't, they would come, take one of your cows, and give it to your neighbor. It was not optional. This was mandatory. The assumption was you would do this as a good Christian. And if you didn't, the community would do it for you. Remember, this is a middle-class society. Very few wealthy people, almost nobody really poor, because the community would get together and help out the poor. If you accumulated too much property or too much wealth, then it was your Christian duty to split it among those who were more needy, and if you didn't, they would come and take it from you. Average farm was about 100 acres. Almost all of them were less than 150 acres. An acre produced at the time about 30 bushels of corn or rye or potatoes later on. That was all the average farm family needed. And the extra you would trade for things like shoes in town from the cobbler or a gun or whatever. Your workers were your children. Large farms, number one, were very difficult because the land is not great and very rocky. This is why when you travel around New England today, you see rock walls everywhere. They pulled the rocks out of the field and piled them up. There's a book on the list about the rock walls. What they didn't know is the more rocks they dug out, the more unstable the soil became and the more rocks were pushed to the surface over the freezing winters. But their goal was to create enough farmland, of course. Your children were your labor. There was no other labor. Everybody else's children was working on their own farms. So it doesn't do much good even to have 500 acres because you can't get the workers for it. You had to have a woodlot. The average house burned about 12 tons or an acre of wood, an acre of trees per year just to stay warm. Everybody is a farmer. Even ministers were farmers. Almost everybody, even craftsmen in town. Everybody had a farm because everybody is self-supporting and feeding themselves. New England laws divided the land between all children. So daughters as well could inherit land, unlike England. Marriage was a civil and a religious contract. You could divorce. It was legally possible to divorce, but extremely rare. They tried to preserve families whenever possible. Quote, families are the nurseries of the church and the commonwealth. As the book says, the husband is the authority. If this is an orderly, hierarchical society, the husband plays the role of God in the family. And there's a great line out of New England, husband and wife are one person, and that person is the husband. He is responsible for everyone in the household. He's responsible for food, for shelter, for teaching literacy, a skill when the children are older, proper behavior, helping to find a spouse for his children, providing land or enough for his children to start their own lives. Even if you had workers in the house, he is responsible for everybody under his roof. So if he had a hired man, for example, or one of his children who accidentally killed a neighbor's cow, they didn't come to the hired man. They didn't come to the child. They came to the father, and he had to repay any losses. Your word was the key thing. Neighbors could veto land sales if you wanted to sell your land. So again, the community idea. Having children was almost required. They didn't know how not to have children. If you didn't have children, that was, and this did happen, people were barren, it was grounds for divorce. So a husband could remarry to have children to inherit his property. So the number one role of the woman was to obey. Children also, their number one responsibility, obey, obey, obey. Wife is subordinate to the husband. They were called good wives. You didn't even have a first name in the legal documents. You were good wife Smith or good wife Jones. She takes care of the house. She takes care of the children and anything doing with food. So the dairying is all hers. Shearing the sheep, spinning the wool, knitting the clothes or weaving the clothes, those are all hers. Anything to do with food production other than slaughtering the animals. The garden is hers, making beer and cider is hers, gathering plants is hers, cooking, washing, spinning, sewing. We have no idea how long it took just to provide for a family. To grind a cup of cornmeal by hand, try it sometime, takes an hour, 1 cup. So all day, basically, you are providing food in one form or another. There are very little birth control, kids every 2 to 3 years, pretty much, and your life is pregnant, nursing, and then you die, pretty much. That's women's lives. They cooperated with neighbors to share work, to share equipment, and the part of the role of a good wife was to be charitable to your neighbors. You weren't considered a decent woman unless you were helpful to your neighbors as well. Another word for a wife was a deputy husband, because in the absence of a husband, if he was on a trip, if he was someplace else, she could take over, run a business, or run a farm. Abigail Adams did this when John Adams was in England for years at a time. She could even buy and sell land in her husband's name in his absence. Women, as long as they were church members, could vote. Not in most places, but in Massachusetts they could. By law, if the husband died, the wife got 1/3 of the estate. The rest of it went to the children. If you had no sons, the land could go to the daughter, but the male relatives sometimes would challenge this. Husband was responsible for all debts. Women could not be sued. They would come after the husband, including the wife's debts before even the marriage. But they exist as appendages of their husbands. Their first names are not even written down in the legal records. Okay, the role of children: obey, obey, obey. And there's some really good slides, 17 and 18, showing children. Children were seen as miniature adults. Quote, until a child will obey his parents, he can never be brought to obey God. Break their wills to save their souls. How often did kids get whacked around? Probably pretty rarely. It happened, but was extremely rare. The thought of disobeying your parents probably didn't cross these kids' minds too often. And besides, if you disobey your parents, God is going to be mad at you and punish you somehow. So it probably didn't happen too often. Constant supervision, constant interaction with the parents. You could discipline your children, strangers could not at all. But punishment was rare. If you're whacking your kids around, everybody in the community knows one thing very quickly: you haven't raised them right. You haven't done a good job as a parent. So there's a built-in motive to have your children obey. Kids did whatever the parents did starting at age 4 or 5. They knew babies were babies. But again, in those portraits there, you can see they're dressed just like little adults. From the age of 5 or 6, they're doing whatever their parents are. They're out plowing with dad, or they're milking the cow, or they're spinning yarn, or whatever it was. At the age of 12 or 13, you picked an occupational track, a career, which is usually almost always what your parents did. You were considered an adult, functioning person at the age of 16, married fairly young, 20 to 25, boys older. And you had to have either a farm or an occupation as a male to get married, because what's going to happen 9 months later? You're going to start having kids. 10 to 12 kids was normal. This was the average size family. 20 to 25 was not rare at all. There is no birth control. So think of the lives of these women. They're constantly pregnant or nursing. Schooling, education, daily, except for Sundays, of course. And the first thing they did, of course, after building a church, and the church was used as a school until a separate school could be built. School would last 7 to 8 hours, usually 5 days a week again. One guy, and this is in Delaware, had 16 children. We have records on this. It's pretty astounding. 16 children. Before he died, he saw 68 grandchildren and 238 great-grandchildren. Population booms in Massachusetts very, very quickly because of the huge birth rate. Okay, let me talk one more thing. The most important thing, again, is cohesion of the family. There is a book on the list, A Midwife's Tale. This was a midwife in Maine shortly after Puritan settled there. And for 30 years, she was the local midwife. She kept a diary. She delivered 814 babies. And remember, you have to go in the middle of the winter, horseback, across the river to deliver these babies. 814 babies. Of those 814, only 20 were recorded as births to single women, unmarried women. And of those 20, only 7 had no known fathers. The mother refused to say who the father was. This was important because whoever was named as the father by the mother legally had to support the child until he became an adult. Did they lie about it? Let's pick out the richest guy and say he's the dad. Probably not. Because remember, again, they're Puritans. If you lie, God is going to strike you dead. So probably they named the actual father. But think about that. 7 out of 814 were truly single parents raising the child on her own. That's the basic plot of the Scarlet Letter. She refuses to name the father because the father, of course, is the town minister, which would have gotten him in a lot of trouble. This is very different than society today, where we have something like 50% of births, more in some demographics, to unmarried couples. There's issues on both ways, but again, the Puritan goal was stability, a stable, controlled society, stable marriages. The key thing was those children are supported until they become self-supporting. It's a very, very different world, very strange society to us today. Okay, stay safe, and we'll finish up with the next one. Thank you.